Good evening and welcome. My name is Emma Melhop, and I'm a senior at Duke studying economics and global health. I'm focusing on health economics through my honors thesis and plan on attending Johns Hopkins post-baccalaureate pre-medical program next year before ultimately applying to medical school. So I'm especially excited to hear from tonight's guests. It's great to have so many people here tonight. As you hear from our guests, if you have any questions, please post them in the Q&A feature at any time throughout the program. Tonight's program is hosted by Jewish Life at Duke, which is the Jewish home away from home for Duke students and a resource for our Jewish faculty, staff, alumni, and parents. Comprising the Freeman Center for Jewish Life and the Rubinstein Silvers Hillel, Jewish Life at Duke takes a pluralistic approach to Judaism to ensure that all Jewish students, regardless of affiliation, are welcome and included. As a student, I've been lucky to experience the impact of Jewish Life at Duke firsthand. I learned about my Jewish roots halfway through my sophomore year at Duke. I then began exploring my Jewish identity while studying abroad my junior year. When I returned, I was eager to get involved in Jewish Life at Duke in order to better understand my background and identity. I was immediately embraced by a supportive community, and even though I did not attend my first JLD event until late into my time at Duke, it was as if I had been a member of the community all along. I quickly became involved in the Jewish Learning Fellowship, a 10-week seminar that focuses on life's big questions and how we can incorporate Jewish values into our daily lives. After participating in the seminar as a fellow, I was honored to return as an intern for the fall 2020 cohort and to return again as a fellow this semester in the inaugural JLF Racial Justice cohort. The friends that I have made at JLD in just a little over a year have become an invaluable support system during my final years at Duke. And the guidance of Rabbi Alana and JLD's director, Joyce Gordon, has allowed me to deepen my identity as a Jew and explore my Jewish faith despite my busy schedule as a college student. Jewish Life at Duke and the Jewish Student Union host a B'nai Mitzvah program each year for students who did not become B'nai Mitzvah as teenagers. This year, I've been studying with Rabbi Alana to become a Bat Mitzvah this April, learning to read Hebrew, chant Torah, study my Parsha, and lead prayers. When I first came to the Freeman Center with the hopes of exploring my Jewish identity, Rabbi Alana ended our conversation by welcoming me home, and Jewish Life at Duke has become just that. I'm honored to represent Jewish Life at Duke in welcoming you to this event. In today's program, we'll be hearing from Dr. Robert Lefkowitz. Dr. Lefkowitz is a Howard Hughes Medical Institute investigator who has spent 48 of his 53-year career as a physician scientist at the Duke University Medical Center. He and Brian Kobilka, a postdoctoral fellow in Lefkowitz's lab in the 1980s, were awarded the Nobel Prize in Chemistry in 2012 for their work on G protein-coupled receptors. Dr. Lefkowitz is a James B. Duke Professor of Medicine, Professor of Biochemistry, and Professor of Chemistry. He is a member of the National Academy of Sciences, the National Academy of Medicine, and the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. Dr. Lefkowitz's memoir, A Funny Thing Happened on the Way to Stockholm, was published just last month and chronicles his journey from cardiologist to legendary scientist and winner of the Nobel Prize, reveling in the joy of science and discovery. When he received the Nobel Prize, the press corps in Sweden described Dr. Lefkowitz as the happiest laureate. I am also thrilled to welcome Mr. David Rubenstein, who will interview Dr. Lefkowitz. Mr. Rubenstein is a former Blue Devil who graduated magna cum laude from Duke. He is the co-founder and co-chairman of the Carlyle Group and the former chairman of the Duke Board of Trustees. Currently, Mr. Rubenstein chairs the Board of Trustees of the John F. Kennedy Center for the Performing Arts and the Council on Foreign Relations, and he is involved with many other philanthropic, civic, and cultural organizations. He is also the host of the David Rubenstein Show, peer-to-peer conversations on Bloomberg TV and PBS. Mr. Rubenstein, himself a member of Duke's Jewish alumni community, has long been a supporter of Jewish Life at Duke's work to make Duke a destination for both a great education and a positive Jewish experience. Welcome back to Duke, Mr. Rubenstein.
Thank you very much. And thank you for that overly kind introduction and overly generous. And Bob, thank you very much for making the time to be with us tonight.
My pleasure.
Bob, when you were growing up in the Bronx, did you say that you wanted to spend the bulk of your life in North Carolina, or did you really say you wanted to be a Major League Baseball player?
Well, I guess neither. I would have aspired to be a Major League Baseball player, but it became fairly apparent to me at a young age that I was not genetically equipped for athletics.
Well, when did you realize that young Jewish boys from the Bronx were not built like Mickey Mantle?
Fairly early on. I was a big fan of Mickey Mantle, the fabled center fielder for the New York Yankees. One of the things that I was kind of a nerdy youth, but one of the problems that may have slowed my appreciation of that was the fact that everybody around me was the same. I grew up in the East Bronx in a heavily Jewish neighborhood, and so all the kids I played with were equally nerdy and equally unathletic. So it took me a while to figure out that this was not the norm.
So I assume, like most Jewish parents, your parents said you could be a doctor or a lawyer or a dentist. Is that right?
Well, actually, they very much approved of my wanting to be a physician. And that was something that I came to very early, maybe about age 7 or 8 or 9, based on idolizing my family physician. I don't recall them pushing me in that direction. On the other hand, they seemed quite happy with that choice.
So you went to college at Columbia and then medical school there. Were you afraid to leave New York to go to college or medical school?
I don't think so. I think it was more the fact that I had at a very early age a high school sweetheart who became my first wife, Arna. And so by the time I headed off to college, I was kind of inclined to stick around. And then by medical school, it was even more serious. So I think that was probably the major restraining influence.
Why did you actually want to be a cardiologist if you were going to be a doctor? Why did you not consider something more important like private equity?
Well, I must say private equity was not on my radar screen then. But my father, unfortunately, and to a lesser extent my mother, suffered from premature coronary artery disease. He had his first of 4 heart attacks when he was 50 and I was 12. Heart attacks and atherosclerosis in general were looked on very, very differently in those days than they are today. So the treatment of choice for anybody who had had a heart attack was to essentially tell them they were not to exercise in any way, and they were to basically treat themselves like an invalid. Well, my father went on to have 4 heart attacks over 12 years, and he died at age 63. That left a huge impression on me. And I think that was probably, as is the case for many physicians, one of the most important determinants of my subspecialty interest.
Well, when you were in college and medical school, the Vietnam War was going forward, and a lot of young men your age and my age were being drafted to go to Vietnam. Some volunteered, of course. What did you want to do with respect to Vietnam, and how come you didn't go to Vietnam?
So that's an interesting and I think an important story. I was morally opposed to the war, as were many of my generation. You may recall what an unpopular war it was. There were demonstrations and riots. There was a lottery draft for all men over 18. But for physicians, there was no lottery. It was a very different situation. All physicians were drafted 100% upon graduation from medical school. You were then given a further 2-year deferment to pursue an internship and 1 year of residency. And then you went in, Army, Navy, Air Force, or United States Public Health Service. Now, the United States Public Health Service was considered one of the military branches at that time. So that would fulfill your draft obligation. But many of the assignments that the Public Health Service had were stateside. And so it became a very popular commission to get. Everybody wanted to be in the Public Health Service because if you could get in there, you probably weren't be shipped to Vietnam. But it was very, very competitive. One of the really choice assignments you could get in the Public Health Service was to be assigned to the NIH to help take care of the patients who were undergoing clinical tests and to sort of learn how to do research. Everybody wanted to get that. Because I had high grades and high standing and recommendations, I was able to get that commission and be sent to the NIH for 2 years. We came to be called somewhat derisively Yellow Berets, which was a takeoff on green berets, who of course are elite special forces, yellow, of course, denoting cowardice, which we didn't see ourselves as having. Anyway, ultimately, the moniker actually became more of a badge of honor because so many of us who came out of that program went on to, do important things in research.
Were you the only person in that group when you were there who won the Nobel Prize, or did a lot of people win Nobel Prizes in that group?
The latter. It is an absolutely extraordinary record. So in the period from 1964 to 1972, the peak years of the Vietnam War, about 50 people going to the NIH in this program every year, all physicians, most without any prior research experience. So from 64 to 72, 10 of us would go on to win the Nobel Prize. Get this, 8 of us Jewish.
What happened to the other 2? Did they convert or not?
They haven't converted yet. But I wouldn't be surprised.
So where did you do your residency? After you left the NIH, where did you go to do your residency as a cardiologist?
I went to the Massachusetts General Hospital in Boston, which is one of the main teaching hospitals associated with Harvard.
So when you're doing cardiology residency, you're supposed to help treat patients, and you were sneaking off to the side and doing research. How did you not get fired for that?
Well, I almost did, or at least I thought I was going to. It was kind of interesting because my 2 years at the NIH did not go smoothly in terms of the research. For the first year or year and a half, I was all thumbs, so to speak. And the only thing I was sure of was that I wasn't destined to be a researcher. So I made arrangements to complete my residency training and do cardiology. And so I went off to Boston to do that, as I said. But during the first 6 months of a very intense senior residency period, I realized that something was kind of missing from my life. And I came to the epiphany that, I really miss doing experiments. And so I found a mentor who took me into his laboratory. The problem was you were paid with hospital dollars as a resident. So you were not supposed to be doing research, but he played along. I was eventually caught one night carrying some test tubes through the hall when the house staff director happened to come through, but saw what I was doing and hauled me into the chief of medicine's office the next day. Fortunately for me, the chief of medicine was a physician scientist himself and a serious researcher. And he, after slapping me on the wrist, said, well, tell me all about the research. What are you doing? And then he kind of looked the other way.
So you got an unsolicited offer from a very unusual place you hadn't ever visited called Duke University. How did you happen to get that offer, and what did your mother think about that?
So the offer came because the chief of the cardiology division, a man named Andy Wallace, not surprisingly, attended the American Heart Association meeting every year, which is held in November. And for 2 of the 3 years that I was in Boston, I made presentations of my early research at that meeting. He saw me and said, hey, I think this young guy is onto something. And he started trying to recruit me to Duke, which was sort of an interesting story because I didn't want to come. I already had lined up a position for the following year as an assistant professor at Harvard. And so I actually turned down the initial offer here. But then they said to me, well, what would it take to bring you to Duke? And well, I didn't want to come. The idea of going that far south was not attractive, at least to me at that point. So they said, why don't you write down what you would like in the way of resources, and we'll see if we can meet it. So I made up what I thought were preposterous requests. I wanted to be an associate professor. I wanted 1,500 square feet of space, lots of stuff. But they met the offer, and then I was kind of stuck. There was no way out of it. So I took the job, and we announced it to the family. And it was actually my mother-in-law, not my mother. When she heard the news, she said, I'll never forget it, quote, Duke? I hadn't heard of it. Is it a new school? Well, so I kind of explained, but.
So when you arrived at Duke, was there a big Duke Center for Jewish Life at the time?
There was no Center for Jewish Life, but the medical school in particular was really going through a transition. So I arrived a year after Ralph Snyderman, my closest friend, who would go on to be the CEO of the entire medical center. And then another guy named Harvey Cohn arrived about the same time, also from Brooklyn, like Ralph. And then three guys came to the dermatology division, all Jewish. But just to give you an idea, I couldn't afford, as a young academician, to live in something called Hope Valley, which is, one of the, at least then was one of the richest and Goyish neighborhoods in the local area. And there was a Hope Valley Country Club. And a guy named Bill Anlian, who was the dean of the medical school, invited a group of young professors who had just become Howard Hughes Medical Institute investigators to a dinner there. But it turned out at the time, I'm not making this up, they did not permit Jews in the club. So we had to change the venue to someplace else. They changed that rule a year or two after. This would have been about 1974.
Bob, if you could have afforded to live in Hope Valley, you still wouldn't have been able to buy a house in Hope Valley.
I think that's true. We live not far from Hope Valley. So when people would ask me, well, where do you live? I would say, I live in the Hope Valley area, but it was on literally the other side of the road, so to speak.
So for those people that might have taken geology as a science course, can you explain in very, very simple terms what you actually did your research in? Can you explain what this is in simple terms?
Yes. So I discovered a family of what are called receptors. So I had it in my head from the earliest days and some of the work I did at the NIH that there must be specific sites on cells with which drugs and hormones interact, sort of like locks into which the drugs or hormones like adrenaline or dopamine or serotonin, into which they fit, much like a key fits into a lock. And that would essentially open the gateway of the cell to do what that hormone or drug wants. So adrenaline wants to make the heart beat stronger and faster, for example, so you can get away from that bear that's chasing you. But it doesn't do anything to your eye or to your nose or your prostate. It doesn't affect how you smell or taste. Now, how does it know to affect the heart? So my idea was there must be some sort of receptor, some sort of lock that this key, adrenaline, can fit. It was a very controversial idea at the time. So when I came to Duke in '73, I set out to see if I could prove that there was such a thing as a receptor for adrenaline. And through many years of biochemical work, I was able to develop a whole suite of techniques which allowed me to demonstrate, one, that there was such very specific binding sites for adrenaline, two, to isolate them and characterize them, clone their genes. And then in the process, I found out that there were very similar molecules that acted as receptors for all kinds of things. I mentioned dopamine, serotonin, but also there were receptors that allowed us to taste and to smell and to see. And they all looked the same. They were like brothers and sisters in terms of their chemical structure. So all of this work went on over a period of several decades. And in the process, many drugs were developed, not by me, but by the pharmaceutical industry, because everybody realized that the receptors that we had discovered were very druggable. It was very easy to develop drugs to fit into them because of their structure. Today, they say about 1/3 of all FDA-approved drugs target these receptors. That's about 700 drugs. Things like antihistamines, beta blockers, all kinds of things like that.
And did you get a royalty on all those 700 drugs?
I got nada, nothing. But a great deal of pleasure and pride from realizing that what we had set out to do out of sheer curiosity and desire to understand things had such wonderful clinical and therapeutic implications and results. Because that was not, I didn't set out to discover a drug or a treatment or anything else. I was just curious about how this all worked.
But in today's modern world, if you had discovered this today, would the universities be all over you to kind of get it patented or something, and you would have gotten something, or universities would have gotten something?
Yes. Back in the day when I was making a lot of my most important discoveries, we weren't even thinking about patents. And in retrospect, I could have patented a lot of stuff that I did, but we didn't. We didn't even think of those things. And there was not like an office of something now, an OLV, Office of Licensing and Ventures. Nobody came to talk to me, and I was too busy to think about it. So we did nothing with that.
So you were supposed to be, and you were trained as a cardiologist, but you're doing all this research. So did you give up being a cardiologist, or were you still seeing patients while you were at Duke?
I was still seeing patients for about 30 years. I loved clinical teaching and enjoyed that very much. But eventually, I realized that, I was spending so little time on it that I felt I was losing my edge. And so eventually, after 30 years of rounding with students and fellows, I hung up my stethoscope. But I'll tell you, I still carry an active medical license to this day, even though it cost me $400 a year. And as my wife points out, I have not seen a patient in 15 years. And she wants to know why I carry the license. And the best answer I can give you is that I'm a doc. It's just part of my identity. It's part of who I am. It's what I dreamed of doing for so many years, and I can't give up the license.
Oh, but like if somebody gets injured on an airplane and they need a doctor, that happened to you once. You saved somebody's life on an airplane, right?
That's correct. Actually, it happened more than once, but I did have a funny experience on a flight. My wife and I were coming back from London a number of years ago. We had only been in the air for about 15 minutes when the pilot comes on, plaintively requesting, is there a physician on board? In general, because I didn't spend a lot of my time doing clinical work, I generally would defer to anybody else on the plane who responded. On this occasion, despite several requests, nobody responds. And so I realized, well, I guess I'm it. So I identify myself, and the flight attendant takes me back, where I find a woman having a grand mal seizure. Her husband is terrified next to her. I take a brief history from him, unrevealing. I examine her quickly. There's nothing to be found. Her blood pressure is a little high, not surprisingly. And she's clearly, the seizure does not abate. So she's in what we call status epilepticus. There's nothing I can do to treat her. You would need intravenous medication. So at that point, the flight attendant says, the captain would like to see you in the cockpit of the plane. So I go up there. Now I'm starstruck myself. Here I am in for the first time in my life, in the cabin of a 747 with all the gauges and lights. I'm looking around. Here's the captain, who's right out of central casting. And he turns to me and he says, Doc, you got to tell me what to do here. He says, we're going to be heading out over open ocean in about 5 or 10 minutes. My last stop, my last chance to stop here is Shannon Airport in Ireland. And you got to tell me what to do. And I'll never forget it, because in that moment, I had an image of myself as being in a movie. I'll never forget it. And I'm playing the lead role, and I've got this life and death decision to make. And so I remember I turned to the captain and I said, this is a quote. I said, Captain, take her down. He says, that's all I need to hear, Doc. You go strap yourself in. And he put the plane into a dive. I mean, wow, it was amazing. And we landed and they came in, and I talked to the attendants who were going to take care of her, told her what I knew about the story. And then I sat down. And then the captain gets on the microphone again. And he says, I want to share with people on the plane, we had this emergency, but fortunately, Dr. Robert Lefkowitz from Duke University was here, saved the patient's life, which is, to say that's an embellishment is an understatement. But Dr. Lefkowitz saved the patient's life. And so, Dr. Lefkowitz, if you and your wife would please move up to first class and be our guest for the remainder of the flight, which we were happy to do. Meanwhile, my wife had slept through most of what was going on, so I had to explain to her what the story was. But yeah, that was quite an experience.
You mean a Duke professor already wasn't flying first class?
Well, not at that stage of my life. These days, since the Nobel, I've been flying first class.
So let me ask you, if your mother has heart disease and your father has heart disease, under the rules of genetics, it seems like you would probably have heart disease. Do you have heart disease, and did you have heart disease?
Absolutely. Both my parents had premature coronary disease. I had the sense very early in my life that I would be stricken with this. I started jogging when I was very young in the hopes that that would, have an effect. But at exactly the same age as my father, he was 50 when he had his heart attack, I developed angina, which is different from a heart attack in the sense that you've not completely blocked off a blood vessel and infarcted or had tissue in the heart die. But whenever you exert yourself, you get chest pain because there isn't enough blood supply going to the exercising heart. That's called ischemia. And in what is always be just amazing to me, I would run every day with classical anginal pain for the better part of a year before admitting to myself that that's what was going on. I found so many ways to talk myself out of the fact that this was angina. Anyway, long story short, at age 51, I underwent quadruple bypass here at Duke. And that was quite a grueling experience. Actually, though, things went well, and knock wood, I have been basically fine ever since. I still exercise every day. I don't run anymore because of various orthopedic impediments, but I do a lot of aerobic exercise.
Okay, well, were you worried that, if I were in your situation, I'd say I might have made an enemy somewhere in the cardiology department. Do I want these people really opening up my chest and making sure that they put everything in the right place? Why wouldn't you go to some place where you might not have any enemies, or you didn't have?
Well, I guess I felt actually much the opposite. I felt not only did I have no enemies here, but I had a lot of people who were really good friends and maybe even admirers. And in fact, just a quick story about that. So all this was coming to a head in June of, I guess, 1994. And I had picked the surgeon, or actually David Sabiston, who was a good friend of mine, who was chief of surgery and cardiovascular surgery, handpicked the surgeon for me. But the Jerry Reeves, who was the chairman of the anesthesia department at the time, and who was one of the most noted cardiac anesthesiologists in the country, was the guy I wanted to do the anesthesia. But he was on holiday for a week during the surgical date. This guy, he was actually down in South Carolina, or some island off the coast of South Carolina. This guy flies back in the middle of his week's vacation. He flies back to Duke, does the case, does the anesthesia, stays for 2 days to make sure everything is cool, and then he went back. So, I mean, that's the kind of friends I had.
Well, let me ask you about a thing that relates to your mother. Was your mother impressed when you started winning all these awards because of your research on receptors? You started getting awards here and there and everywhere. Was your mother impressed with that her boy had done well?
My mother was a tough one to impress. So when I was a youngster, she was a perfectionist. If I would bring home an A-, she would want to know why not an A. If I brought home an A, well, did anybody get an A+? So when I first started winning these prizes, I would say I was about 40 at the time. Every time I would call her up and say, "Hey, Mom, good news, I won such and such a prize for my research." And she'd say, "Oh, that's very nice, Bobby, but," she says, "it's not the Nobel. When are you going to get the Nobel?" Well, that went on and on and on. And of course, I did get the Nobel, but she was long gone by then. Hopefully she's looking down and she got to see.
So if you ever had any doubt that your mother was Jewish when she kept saying, "What about the Nobel?" you had no doubt she was Jewish, right?
That's absolutely true. And my mother was sort of, to me, she was such a classic. Let me tell you a story about my mother that I think anybody who had a Jewish mother, which I assume is most of the people listening to this, will appreciate. So my mother, bless her soul, despite her heart disease, lived to be 89. But during the last year of her life, she lived in Florida. Things kind of fell apart there. And so my wife, Lynn, and I brought her up here and installed her in one of the nicest sort of nursing homes about a mile from Duke. And I would visit her religiously every single night. I would leave the lab at 6 and I would go to her room and I'd walk in at 6:10, plus or minus 1 minute. And we would go through the same routine every night. I walk in, my mother looks at me, looks down at her wrist where she had this huge wristwatch. And she says, "It's about time." I said, "Mom, what do you mean it's about time? You know I work till 6. I've come the same time every night. What do you mean it's about time?" She shrugged. I'd stay exactly 1 hour. We watch the news together, maybe do a little crossword puzzle. Now it's 10 after 7. And I say, Mom, it's time for me to go home. She'd look at her watch. She'd say, you call this a visit? And I'd say, Mom, it's an hour already. It's 7:15. I haven't eaten dinner. I haven't eaten for 12 hours. She would shrug. Next night, I'd arrive, same story, same comment, same everything. So that was Mom.
So did you get tired, not just of your mother, but other people saying, how come you haven't won the Nobel? Did you get tired of hearing that?
Yes. And it was, I didn't win the prize until relatively late in my career. I was 69. Although frankly, that's probably not all that atypical. But there had been several what are called near misses at 10-year intervals, where twice a prize was awarded in an area close enough to my work that reasonable people would conclude that, hey, Bob could have been included in that prize, and he wasn't. And they gave, like, 2 people got a prize, etc. And so, yeah, everybody kept saying to me, Bob, the reassuring ones would tell me, Bob, you're going to win the prize. You're going to, just a matter of time. Others would just over and over again ask me, when are you going to win? When are you going to win? And to be honest with you, when I did win, and I got that call, and I remember the very first thing that popped into my head was not, yay, this is wonderful. It was really more like the monkey was off my back. And I remember thinking to myself that, golly, I'm never, ever again going to have to answer the question, when are you going to win the Nobel Prize? And that was a good feeling.
Before you actually won it, you got a call one morning early, when around the time the Nobel Prizes were being awarded, by somebody who called you up to ask you about the Nobel Prize, but it wasn't for you. Were you disappointed that somebody called you about somebody else's Nobel Prize?
I was devastated because, my heart stopped. So it turns out that the receptors that I studied are called G protein coupled receptors, because G proteins, which are a certain kind of protein, are the proteins that these receptors stimulate. So when I said, adrenaline fits into the receptor turns, and it interacts with something called the G protein. So in the year in question that you're speaking of, 2 guys who had discovered G proteins got the Nobel Prize, okay? And they could have, everybody at the time said, well, they could have given it to Lefkowitz because your receptors and G proteins, love and marriage, horse and carriage, receptors and G proteins, they go together, but they didn't. They just gave it to those 2 guys for the G protein. So I hadn't heard the prize announcement yet. The phone rings, and the guy says to me, so, Dr. Lefkowitz, what do you think of today's Nobel Prize? And I said to him, did I win? He said, no, Rod Bell and Gilman won for G proteins. And, I didn't say what I was thinking, but I was a little peeved. But I tried to put on, a wonderful prize, I told him. I had to write a lot of essays, 2 or 3 essays in journals, because I was an obvious guy to comment on their prize, from a scientific perspective.
So when you finally did win, the most important person at Duke finally called you up and you met him for the first time, Coach K.
Yes, indeed. And we had a wonderful interaction. So Coach K called me up, I guess the day after I had gotten the call. Of course, I was a big fan of his. I've been an Iron Duke for decades, but I had never had any personal interaction with the coach. He called me the very next day, and we had a lovely conversation. We must have talked at least 20 minutes or more. And, he congratulated me, and he basically said, look, I feel a certain affinity for you, Bob, because he says, look, I brought us the university our very first NCAA basketball championship. You brought us our very first Nobel Prize. We want to honor you down at Cameron. So if you could come down next week, because remember the calls about the Nobel go out the beginning of October, and the official practice season begins mid-October. They call it countdown
to craziness.
Countdown to craziness. There you go. So you come down, countdown to craziness. We're going to honor you. I said, well, what are you going to do? He said, well, you'll see when you get there. Well, to make a long story short, he called me to center court, and they presented me with my own jersey with the number 1. and my name spelled correctly, which is always nice. And there I stood, and the team, and I've never felt so short standing there with the whole team. The team and the coach retreated, and I was going to walk off with them, but he said, no, you stay there and just listen to it for a minute, because the kids were screaming. And as you know, the Duke students who sit closest to the floor are always chanting things at opposing players, cute things in unison, often, typically when somebody's fouling out. But anyway, I could hear that they were chanting something at me, and they were pointing like this, and they were chanting something, which I couldn't hear at first. And then it came into focus. They were saying, "He's so smart. He's so smart." Well, that was such a high. I put my arms up in the air. We got a great picture of that. But there's a follow-up to this story. So anyway, I took the jersey back to my office, what to do with it. And, I said, well, look, when they retire a jersey of an all-star player at Cameron, they hang it from the rafters. So I literally hung it from the rafters. It hangs to this day in my office from the ceiling, directly next to the Nobel Prize. So you can take a picture which has both of them in there. So I'm very, very proud of that, number one. 3 years later, they win another national championship. And a picture appears in the Chronicle of the coach and the team and the president, Broadhead, with Obama, the president. And they are presenting him with a Duke jersey, and it's got the number 1 on it. I'm outraged. It's my number. It's retired. So I immediately by then I had become a friend of Coach K. We've done some things together with his leadership seminar. So at this point we were friends. So I immediately shoot off an email to him saying, "Hey, Coach, I'm thrilled that we won. I'm thrilled that the president's entertaining the team, but you're giving him my number and it's retired, as you can see in this photograph," which I sent him. Within an hour, I get a note back from him. Bob, he says, "Look, you got to understand. We had to do it. He's the president of the United States. But look," he says, and I know, you're the real number 1. I wrote back, I said, "Coach, all is forgiven."
So tell us what it's like to go to Stockholm. When you go over there, is it just a 1 hour ceremony? You go for a week, or how does it work?
It's basically the most incredible experience you can imagine. Typically, Nobel Week, justly named, is really about Nobel 10 days. From the moment you arrive until the moment you leave, you're basically in a fantasy world, living a life that, I don't know, you probably live like this all the time. So
really,
let me give you an example. So the plane lands, we're sitting in first class, of course, and the pilot announces, "I just want everybody on the plane to know that we have one of this year's Nobel laureates, Dr. Robert Lefkowitz, is sitting up here in first class. I would appreciate it if everybody could stay in their seats until he and his wife can deplane." Okay, well, that's pretty special. So we get our gear, we go to the door, we're the first ones leaving the plane, and at the door, we are met by various dignitaries, the head of the Nobel Foundation, the head of the committee, the chemistry committee that had decided I was getting the prize, and a special, a woman who I had been corresponding with, who was to be my sort of guide and assistant for the whole week. So they greet us, and then rather than going onto the jetway, they have a special stairway set up for us to walk down to the tarmac. So we walk down to the tarmac, which is crazy. Who of us standing on the tarmac looking up at the nose of a 747, where is parked our personal limousine with there was a BMW 7 Series with so much stuff you can't believe it, and a Nobel insignia on the side, and a driver. We get in, they sweep us off to a special VIP lounge where I guess, visiting dignitaries, politicians, hedge fund managers come. And we sit there. There's nobody else in there. They take our baggage stubs and passports. We don't go through passport control. We don't go to get our luggage. They do all of that, take us into town, put us up at the this wonderful hotel, the Grand Hotel. And then it's just one event after another, cocktail receptions, meetings. I mean, it just interviews. You're on the front page of the newspaper every day. People recognize you in the street. It's just wild pandemonium the whole week. And you're continuously being recognized, asked for autographs. I mean, we don't have anything like that in this country. Our heroes are sports figures. And then when you get to actually the big day, which is December 10th, the anniversary of Nobel's death, the day on which they have the actual ceremony and then the Nobel banquet for 1,500 people. On that day, it's a national holiday, and they televise for hours and hours. It's sort of the closest analog we have here is Super Bowl Sunday. Okay, it's on all day. This is on all day. And people watch it on TV. All the ceremonies and dinner is all white tie. And there's a custom that people have their own Nobel banquets in their homes, private banquets. They invite relatives and friends. They dress up if they have dress clothes. And they watch the ceremonies. And they publish in the newspaper that day the seating arrangement where all the Nobel laureates are at the central thing. So you can see there's a central table for about 80 people, and then the other 1,500 guests are at perpendicular tables. And you're sitting, I sat between two princesses, for example. The king was across the way, sitting next to my wife, who was sitting next to a prince. And they publish, it's called the Table of Honor. They publish in the newspaper that day the seating plan, so people can watch and say, "Oh, look, so and so's talking to so and so, etc." I mean, it just goes on and on. It's crazy.
So, how did your life change once you won the Nobel? Do people laugh at your jokes more? Do you get better restaurant reservations, or what?
Well, you get asked to pontificate on all manner of stuff. It doesn't matter how little you know or might know about the subject. People want your opinion. I get asked. Well, just to pick an example, I was invited not that long ago to be the keynote speaker at the American Urogynecological Association. And I remember writing back saying, can you tell me a little bit more about your organization and what their interests are? And they wrote back, they said, we are the leading American organization concerned with female incontinence. And I said, I don't think I have a lot to offer. And so I turned down that particular invitation.
So how do you think you think if you had not come to Duke, you would have won a Nobel Prize? Was it inevitable that you would become a Nobel Prize winner because you're pretty smart?
I don't know. I had conceived the idea that I would devote my career to before I came to Duke. So the question is, could I have carried it out elsewhere? And I can't answer that. Serendipity has played an extraordinary role in my career, as I think it probably does in most very successful careers. One thing leading to another, and you say, well, how the hell did that happen? I mean, like, for example, the people who came to work with me in the first few years, incredible people. And, I would always tease with people that, people say to me, how in the world do you pick such amazing talent? And, my strategy was simple. If somebody had a warm body and they were breathing, I would accept them because I needed people to build my laboratory. But the people who came in, from the graduate students to every one of them from the first 10 years went on to some amazing career. Now, could I have gotten the same people at another place? I don't know. So sure, I'd like to think maybe I would have done well. And I was very well supported here. The chairman of medicine, the dean. I wouldn't have become an HHMI investigator so early if it wasn't for Jim Weingarten, the chairman of medicine, who put me up for that. So, yeah, I was, I guess got a lot of advantages being here.
How important have Jewish values been in your life? And how has Jewish life at Duke changed in the 45 plus years you've been at Duke? So
I don't think there was that much Jewish life when I first came down here. And if there was, I certainly don't know about it. And that's a very interesting and deep question. So let me say by way of introduction, I am not a religious person in the sense that, how often do I go to synagogue? Well, always on the high holidays, but Shabbos services, not very often at all. That said, the rabbi at Bethel Synagogue is one of my closest friends. There's a lot of Yiddishkeit in me. I use a lot of Yiddishisms, etc. But when I think about the path of my career and the values, it's really only in recent years that I really even thought that much about, well, how have you lived your life? I think I've just, for the most part, been just so busy living it that I don't really think about it. But I think there are several Jewish values that have really guided both my life and my career. And both of them are things which I basically learned in Hebrew school. And I don't remember that much about what went on in Hebrew school, because for me, it was mainly a time to see my friends and just sort of cut up. But I remember we studied the Pirkei Avot from the Mishnah. And I remember this famous quote from Hillel, probably the only thing I remember from those days. If I am not for me, who will be for me? If I am only for me, who am I? If not now, when? And when I think about that, if I am not for me, who will be for me? Now, I guess there are many ways to interpret that, but I guess the way I always interpret it is, if I don't make something out of myself, nobody else is going to do it for me. I mean, I got to do that. I got to make something out of myself. And so sort of personal responsibility. And of course, if I am not, if I'm only for myself, then who am I? And that seems pretty self-evident. I mean, caring about other people and lifting other people up. And of course, being a mentor, being so important in my career, that's been a value very important to me. And then, of course, if not now, when? I've always had a sense of urgency about whatever I'm doing. I think there are a number of reasons for that, which we could talk more about. But then the other value, which I guess is related to if I am only for me, who am I, is the whole concept of kavod, dignity. I think I'd have to say that's probably the single most precious value to me, the appreciation of everyone's dignity. To me, a myth that everybody is always talking about, which I find offensive, is the notion that everybody's created equal. I mean, if I could hit a ball 500 feet like Mickey Mantle, we were created equal. No, we weren't all created equal. And no, you can't do anything you put your mind to. But so we're not equal in that sense. But what we are equal is we all are equally deserving of our dignity and the respect of others. And I've tried to live that. I mean, you can imagine in my career, I encounter students and people with a tremendous range of intellectual capability. Some of them got a 500 horsepower engine up there, and somebody else got 140, okay? And I can't expect the same kind of output from the two. But I have they're each entitled to the same respect and dignity. So I think that's been probably the single most important value. And to me, that's a very Jewish kind of value.
Now, we have some questions from people who are watching. This one seems to be from one who is either in medical school or wants to go to medical school. What are your best study skills that help you succeed in medical school and residency?
I think there were probably two things. One was my mother was a perfectionist, and she instilled in me a perfectionism, which is both the bane of my existence on some occasions, but it also was one of my most valuable study attributes, because when I would study, it wasn't sufficient in my mind to learn 90% of the material. I had to know everything. So for example, let's say I'm in medical school and I'm studying the differential diagnosis of whatever, fluid around the heart. And according to my books, and of course, I would always use more than one book, there are 10 main causes of that. I would memorize them. And then the next day, and I would write them on cards. The next day I would come back. If I got 8, that wasn't good enough. I would not stop studying that, writing it down. And then anything that I would forget, I'd write down the 2 that I forgot. And then I would come back to them at odd times. So I think a certain sense of perfectionism was one thing. The other thing was probably one of my not quite obsessions, but one of my major characteristics is I love mastery. Mastery of anything is very important. I love mastering something. I love to master things. And I also love games. So for me, I loved studying. Why? It was a big game to me. It was a game, and to win was to absolutely master the material. And I loved it because it was a game. And for the most part, I'm very competitive, but for the most part, I was competing with myself. I just loved to master things.
Okay, Bob, you have 5 children. Are any of them medical doctors?
Not one. In fact, my 5 kids have tended more towards the arts. I have one who writes young adult fiction. Another was an actor and dancer. Now he's a portrait artist. I have another son who's in the rock music business, not on the performing side. And my youngest son for a while was a rapper. That's with an R, not a W. And I have a granddaughter who's a graduate of Wesleyan drama program, who's a professional stage director. So they've all gone in the direction of the arts. And people sometimes say to me, well, you know, I know a physician and all 5 of his kids are academic physicians. So it's an interesting question. And I don't know if I want to know the answer as to why none of them pursued a career anything like my own. But I can tell you this, I never tried to influence them to go into anything. I always told them, you know, the standard line, which I believe myself, is find something you love to do, something you love to do. If you can make that your career, you know, you'll never work a day in your life.
So Linus Pauling won 2 Nobel Prizes. I think Madame Curie did as well. So any plans to win another Nobel Prize anytime soon?
Well, I would love that, but I'd really, and I got some cute new ideas in the last couple of years, but whether I've got enough time to bring them to fruition, I don't know. Another important thing in terms of values is persistence and failure, which is so much a big part of research. And I think almost any successful enterprise is failing. And certainly it's true in research. It's 90% failure. So I don't know if I got enough time to fail enough times to get there, but it would be nice. But I'm comfortable with one. And, you know, the fact that I won in chemistry was a big surprise. I would have thought that if I would have won, we would have won in medicine. But there's a lot of overlap in the areas that they cover. And one of the really proudest moments of my life was the very first night in Stockholm. Brian and I were taken to dinner by the members of the award committee of the chemistry prize. And we were talking over dinner and the subject came up, why didn't we win the prize in medicine? And why did we win it in chemistry? And what the chair of the committee told us, he says, well, to tell you the truth, there was a tug of war. Your nomination was considered by both committees and medicine wanted to give it to you and we wanted to give it to you and we won. Well, that was really a high, you know, to tell you that.
But nobody comes up to you today and says, how come you haven't won 2 Nobel Prizes, right? You're past that.
Exactly. And the funny thing is, many people, when they think of the Nobel Prize, think of only the Nobel Peace Prize. And I cannot tell you how many times people have said to me, congratulations on winning the Nobel Peace Prize. And even more amusing, and this happens, I'm serious, there are a couple of people at Duke who do this all the time. My primary care physician, every time he sees me, says, oh, he'll announce who's ever around. Here comes the winner of the Nobel Peace Prize in medicine, which is wrong on every score.
Well, when you won your Nobel Prize, you went up to the White House and you met with President Obama, who did win the Nobel Peace Prize. So did he congratulate you?
He did indeed. And that was so great that we had about half an hour. So it's a longstanding custom for the United States president to entertain the American laureates as they are on their way to Stockholm to get the awards. This was a long-standing tradition. I don't know who started it. Somebody told me it was with Eisenhower, but I'm not sure. But you won't be surprised to learn that President Trump never met with any of the laureates on any of the 4 years that he was in office. In any case, it was wonderful being with Obama. It's the only time I've met him in person. He was just the way you see him on TV. They always say comfortable in his own skin, and just wonderful to talk to. So at some point, he's talking with us and he says, I really, feel an affinity with you 5 guys, because as you know, like you, I too am a Nobel laureate, he says, but there is one key difference. And then he hesitates and he says, you earned yours, which was obviously a very self-deprecating remark about the fact that I think he got it within a year of taking office. He really hadn't done anything to deserve it at that point.
So if there have been any mentors, if you could cite one mentor in your career who's responsible for your success, is there one mentor other than your Jewish mother?
Yeah, that's a tough one. I was fortunate and in some unusual situation. When I was at the NIH, I had 2 mentors, Jesse Roth and Ira Paston, both physician scientists, both outstanding scientists, but they couldn't have had more opposite personalities and approaches to research. Roth was this remarkably energetic, creative guy. He had an idea a minute and very imaginative, but not particularly rigorous. Okay. Paston, on the other hand, was kind of a dour guy, not much of a sense of humor, very serious. Also creative, but maybe not as much as Roth, but so rigorous. They both have had outstanding careers. They're both still alive, almost 90 years old. But they came at things very differently. So I would do an experiment and I would bring it to Roth. And he'd say, oh, this is fantastic. He would froth at the mouth. He loved it. It get me so excited. I just couldn't stand it. Then I'd go to see Paston and he'd look at that. And I'd say, Jesse was so excited. He said, excited about this? I'd say, yeah. He said, no, wait a minute. Did you do this control? I said, no. Did you do that control? No. Did you do any control? No. He says, this is garbage. You can't interpret this at all. Anyway, from these 2 antithetical styles, I developed my own approach, which is to mentoring and in doing science, which is sort of, I feel, a blend of trying to be upbeat and positive and imaginative, but at the same time, very, very rigorous. And yeah, I mean, they're kind of opposing tendencies, but I sort of absorbed each one from one of those 2 mentors.
So Bob, we're out of time, and I just want to say, I did read your book. A funny thing happened on the way to Stockholm. I greatly enjoyed it, and I highly recommend it to other people. It's really well written, very funny, very humorous, reflects your sense of humor. But let me ask you, the cover picture here, it has your name tag on. Now, do you really need a name tag at Duke when you're walking around the medical complex? Don't they know you? Why do you need that?
Well, it's a good point. I must say that I do know a lot of people here, and it's generally wonderful. But I have found that when I try to walk from my office, which is near Duke North, over to Duke South for, say, a meeting with the dean or something, I will generally encounter, I would say, on average, 6 people I know. Everyone wants to stop and schmooze. And I try, as nicely as I can to say, I'm really late. I have an appointment with the dean at 3 o'clock. And then I'll walk 15 more feet. Oh, Bob, how are you? I haven't seen you, etc. So I guess I don't need the name tag.
Probably not. Bob, it's a great book. It's a great story. Thanks for what you've done for the Duke Center for Jewish Life. Thanks for what you've done for Duke, and thanks for what you've done for humanity.
Thank you so very much, David. I really appreciate you spending this hour with me.
Okay, thank you.
Gentlemen, thank you both so very much. I'm Joyce Gordon. I'm the director of Jewish Life at Duke. And on behalf of Jewish Life at Duke, I truly want to thank you for such a fun conversation. Bob, we learned so much about your Jewish mother. So gratified to learn. I am truly grateful to you both for spending time with us this evening and for all you do for Duke and for us at Jewish Life at Duke. Thank you. I also want to thank our guests. Thank you for spending Tuesday night with us. Jewish Life at Duke is not only the home for Jewish students here on campus, but we aspire to be your Duke Jewish home as well. And so please join us at our upcoming events, which include our Zoom Passover Seders this coming weekend, our Friends and Family Shabbat every month, or Reunion Shabbat coming up next month, or our virtual college fair. If you have a prospective Duke student in your life, we want to get to know them. We also have a young alumni virtual happy hour. I know there are some young alumni on this Zoom, so please look at our website for those events. Finally, I want to say that tonight has highlighted something I treasure about our Duke Jewish community, which is joyful curiosity. As the director here, I have such a great pleasure of getting to know our bright students who are deeply curious about everything. They dig into all the resources that Duke has to offer, including our many Jewish, cultural, educational, and spiritual offerings. So if you're curious about Jewish Life at Duke, I invite you to reach out to me or a member of our team. Again, many, many thanks. Thank you to our moderator, David Rubenstein. Thank you to our guest, Bob Lefkowitz, the original #1, your jersey is retired, for such an engaging evening. A happy Passover to all who celebrate, and have a good night.